Hello and welcome back. I'm your host, Michelle Kasperzak. Our second session tonight at the Fiber Festival is Posthuman Territories. The potential of artificial intelligence, global digital infrastructures, and geoengineering to combat planetary climate change seems considerable. It's often thought that technology can provide the solution. In reality, these technological developments have many drawbacks, disappointments, and ultimately do not benefit everyone. Are there alternative and inclusive routes to a fair future? How do artists view and work with these complex developments? In this session, we explore new territories where man, machine, and landscapes interact in groundbreaking ways. We invite artistic makers and researchers to investigate how alternative forms of engineering can play a role in the development of an inclusive and livable future. Tonight we have 3 guests in this session. 2 virtual and 1 with me here on the table. And we'll start with our virtual guests. So I'd like to right away introduce Holly Jean Buck, a geographer and author, who will begin the address tonight about posthuman territories. Welcome, Holly Jean.
Hi, it's so great to be here.
Yeah, welcome. Well, I'm just going to let you take it away and tell more about your work and yourself.
Well, I'm mostly going to focus on my work, and in grappling with this theme of instability, I'm going to talk about some technical strategies to stabilize the climate system. So a fair amount of background, and then I'm hoping we can discuss the implications of all this.
Fantastic.
I'm just going to share some slides here. So, net zero. Are you all able to see these?
Are the slides? Yeah, slides are working.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, you've probably heard about this concept of net zero. I think it's a good entrance point to climate intervention because net zero refers to balancing some amount of remaining positive emissions with negative emissions. So you've probably heard about all these net zero targets. There's been a lot of corporate announcements of striving for net zero and or carbon neutrality, right? So why would there even be positive emissions in mid-century? It's because some sectors like aviation or cement or rice production can be deemed too difficult to decarbonize. And how much that is a genuinely technical situation versus an economic or political assessment is something that we should discuss. But the main point is that this idea of net zero, this balance, seems to offer a kind of stability or an idea about stability going forward. But actually, we don't just have these ongoing emissions to deal with. We have all the other emissions from the past few centuries still weighing upon us up there, 1 trillion tons of carbon. So we're talking about quite a bit of negative emissions implied for climate stability. This is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says. All pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is the target we're aiming for, with limited or no overshoot, project the use of carbon dioxide removal on the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons over this next century. So being used to compensate for residual emissions, that's the ongoing positive emissions, and in most cases achieve negative emissions to return global warming to 1.5 degrees following a peak. So the idea is to overshoot that target and then return. So some degree of repair or restoration implied already in there. This figure shows the same idea in graphical form, right? So you'll note that current emissions are approaching 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And to achieve, this is a picture for the 2-degree target, first we need a rapid reduction right away, obviously. And then later in the century, there's this point with a little circle where the world is removing more carbon than is being emitted. That's net negative emissions. But all the infrastructure for that, you'll notice this green box on the bottom is really starting right away in 2030, which means that the infrastructure is being built and developed technologically right now. So this isn't just something for later in the century. It's something that needs to be developed if we want to hit these ambitious temperature targets. So how does one remove carbon from the atmosphere? You'll see these kind of diagrams mapping up different ways. Generally, carbon can be stored in ecosystems, or it can be captured and stored in geological formations. And so the natural methods, such as afforestation, such as soil carbon sequestration, require a pretty massive land use and food system transformation, a terraforming of sorts. For example, soil carbon is attractive because soils are such a big reservoir for carbon already. And so much of that soil carbon has been lost through industrial agriculture. Cropland soils losing between 20 and 60% of their original organic carbon content. So people are thinking about how can we put that carbon back into the soils where it was. By growing plants with longer roots, for example. I mean, there's a number of regenerative farming methods that I won't get into today. So people are thinking of those avenues. One challenge with the soil carbon or the planting trees or the methods that might feel more comfortable and familiar is that you can do these year on year, and they have pretty big, high technical potentials at first, a few gigatons per year of storage. But after a while, those sinks become filled up, basically, and you have to keep holding the carbon there, but you can't count on it to remove more over time. And these are also vulnerable because if there's a wildfire, for example, then that carbon is lost back into the atmosphere, which is why most people are also looking at industrial methods of carbon removal. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is one technique that's used in these kind of modeling projections because it combines two familiar things, which is bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. However, scaling this up would require a lot of land. So people are looking at a role for this, for example, with crop residues and forestry waste and so forth, but have shied away from thinking about a lot of dedicated land intentional crops for this because of the experiences that we've had over the past decade or two with biofuels. Direct air capture is something that people are looking to with a lot of hope, I think, because we have pilot scale machines that can take carbon from the ambient air and capture it, and then it needs to be injected underground and stored permanently. Right now, this is expensive and there's a high energy cost. So it implies scaling up our renewable energy infrastructure beyond what we already hope to in order to power these processes. So you can see that none of these negative emissions techniques are guaranteed, and they each have their own limitations. But I mean, this is still kind of where people are placing some hope. And that is technically possible, right? So what's the social arrangement that allows that? I'd like to invite you all to imagine what a world that achieves this kind of simple line on a graph actually looks like. How do people live, work, and play there? How's human health and happiness? How are the relations with non-humans? Is it a just world? And to think about that, I'm going to put forth a couple of scenarios. The first one is a world that does achieve that nice, neat graph, but you probably wouldn't want to live there. For example, you get large plantations, land managed for carbon, but not for other goals, decreased biodiversity, vast fields of solar, wind, and nuclear to power direct air capture, but not arranged in a way that's beneficial, right? And then think about the jobs. I mean, these could be low wage labor jobs, especially for some of the natural farming techniques. There could be, industrial jobs that are match kind of the configuration of the fossil fuel industry, which are mainly a gendered labor force. And overall, the cost of removing all this carbon could be borne by workers. An alternative scenario is that the world makes some kind of attempt on paper to achieve negative emissions, but it doesn't actually make a difference in the climate. So if you're familiar with the history and present of offsetting, there's been, everything from poor monitoring to downright fraud, right? There could be a lot of fanfare about, we're going to do this, but the follow through isn't there. Carbon dioxide removal used for enhanced oil recovery. So one of the main markets right now for carbon that is captured, right now it's actually mined underground, is to inject into depleted wells to recover more oil. So that could be a bridge to nowhere in one scenario. Basically, the greenwashing version of all this, right? I think you can easily imagine that. There's also a possibility that all of this carbon removal / negative emissions is just downright rejected. Either it becomes branded as a false solution and associated with climate grifters, an unworkable techno fix, which you could see how that could be a fair assessment and a fair logic depending on who's developing it and how. Or it could be seen as too expensive, especially if the world is going through bearing the costs of climate change itself and other disasters. And I think that that's also a fairly unjust situation. I mean, if we know how to remove carbon from the atmosphere and clean up this waste, and we don't, the climate impacts from that are worse than they would have been, and they're borne disproportionately. Then there's another world, which I hope we can imagine together, which is where carbon is removed. At the same time, we're progressing on that, we're working towards social and environmental justice. So carbon removal jobs that are good jobs that are available to everyone, carbon removal projects that can bring funds to rural communities and communities that have already been impacted by carbon pollution and other types of pollution, and policy designs that ensure that the costs are borne by those who can afford it. And there's a big discussion in that of what that looks like, obviously. And I'm afraid that if we don't progress on carbon removal and decarbonization broadly and adaptation, then what gets introduced is solar geoengineering. So this is the idealized scheme for solar geoengineering, which is a category of approaches that have to do with reflecting some amount of sunlight back into space to cool the Earth. And so in this idealized setting, this is used as a stopgap or a bridge to buy time to scale up mitigation and carbon dioxide removal to shave the peak off of this warming, to flatten this curve, as it were. So I'll talk a little bit more about that basic idea if it's unfamiliar. There's a few methods. One is to increase the amount of clouds and how reflective they are. So marine cloud brightening. This has been suggested as a temporary measure for cooling coral reefs, for example. Something that gets more attention, particularly in modeling, is putting reflective aerosols into the stratosphere. And so how would that work? That would be a program of continually putting particles up into this upper layer of the atmosphere where they would circulate for a year or so and then come back down. They would circulate around the whole globe. It would be essentially an intentional layer of pollution shielding the Earth. how would that be done? Probably with a small fleet of airplanes that are flying regularly, that are specially designed to carry a load. And what would be this substance? Sulfur dioxide, something that has been modeled because of the analog with volcanoes. Potentially other substances would be better, but the chemistry hasn't fully been investigated. And this, importantly, that would not return us to a prior climate. But the reason it's being discussed is that in models, it can seem better than the worst case climate change scenarios. So this really needs a broader approach because the research on this idea has been very uneven. It's come from, using the same sorts of models that scientists are using to study climate change, but the ecological implications, for example, have not been fully researched. And so there's a big concern that, politicians may grab hold of this idea before it's even fully, we know what it would do, right? And there's a lot of potential negative impacts, including damage to the ozone layer, interference with precipitation patterns. It doesn't address ocean acidification. It changes the tone of the sky, the unknown ecosystem responses I just mentioned, and something referred to as the termination effect or termination shock. So if this scheme, this program is begun, it needs to be maintained because an interruption to it would mean that the warming that has been suppressed would happen pretty much all at once at a much faster rate than the more gradual climate warming, which would be devastating for ecosystems and our own human systems. So I'm concerned, obviously, about this prospect, but it may be what is, brought up as an emergency response. And so I guess there's a lot of questions here, but one that I want to bring up is what the experience with the pandemic illustrates about our capacity to manage emergency responses that are this complex. Because something like carbon removal especially implies this pretty dramatic monitoring system. Solar geoengineering, obviously, too, on a whole other level, both monitoring and predicting what will happen. A lot of sensing, a lot of computational power and data to understand where all these flows are going, what are the effects of the interventions. And I think that with COVID, which is in some ways, I don't know if this is fair to say, but in some ways it's a simpler problem. We have this compound sensing error because on one hand, there's an inadequate capacity to see the virus, to do testing and tracing and tracking what's going on. On the other hand, there's the errors in judgment about what the sensed information means, an inability to weigh the information we're getting about the virus with other matters of danger and concern. And so the different facets of that sensing error implies that more tests and more data won't necessarily fix it. And that makes me concerned about the capacity to manage these types of climate interventions. So in terms of what we can do about that, I hope to discuss it. And I will leave off there. I look forward to our conversations.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's have a little applause, please. I'm old school. I like to applaud. Well, thanks for that. Let's dive right into then this conversation about what the coronavirus epidemic has shown us about how humans manage complex problems and how, I have to admit, the picture you paint is very daunting. It's obviously there's a lot of competing complex factors at play. I suppose, yeah, what have we learned about how we treat these matters and what can we do to mitigate repeating some of the same mistakes as we face the climate challenge?
Yeah, there was just a very interesting commentary in The Lancet from the chief editor about how it's not a pandemic, it's a pandemic plus inequality, right? And so if we can start to understand that, and we have, voices advocating for that view of things, there may be something that's transferable to the climate crisis as well. Like maybe this is a prod where we can start thinking in a more nuanced way about these types of challenges.
Yeah, indeed. I think the inequality part of the equation only, of course, exacerbates all of the problems. So with that in mind, and that also being another problem that we seem to be addressing inadequately, we're compounding all these competing things together. I suppose the way out of it, as you suggested in one of your scenarios, is to pair some of these technological efforts with climate justice efforts. What do some of these climate justice movements that you find hopeful look like, or which ones can you highlight as exemplar at the moment?
I mean, I think there's a lot of great stuff going on. I think that the widespread attention to racism, structural racism, and this shift from understanding racism as a hostile, discriminatory act that's done by an individual towards a more structural view is promising. And I love that, in the US anyway, we're starting to have these conversations in just much wider fora. It's not kind of academic jargon anymore to think about what it means for racism or inequality to be structural. And so once we develop this capacity for a structural view, which we can learn from the social justice movements and apply it to climate change, I think that opens up the solution space a lot more. I think that at the same time, I'm seeing a lot of people that are coming from more technical fields also begin to engage with environmental justice this year in particular, in new ways. And I think everybody's starting to understand that they don't have the full answer set and listen much more to people with different sets of expertise.
Yeah, one thing that came up in the session just previous to this one was the idea of paying more attention to indigenous rights, and also like some of the land and giving back the land, essentially, looking at making reparations. And I think that this kind of conversation can also feed into this is part of a bigger movement towards turning towards things that are solutions that are positive in nature, that are about caretaking and returning to a kind of caretaking and other ways of managing our resources. Would you agree with that, or do you have any thoughts on how that figures into the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think that this is both really promising and that we have a long way to go there, because I think that, I'll get in conversations with people where they're comfortable talking about equality or justice in the abstract, but when you're talking about land return, for some people that becomes really intimidating, especially at the same time as we're talking about solutions that require quite a bit of land. And so I want to encourage people to actually say, I don't think it's an option to avoid those discussions. I think that we just need to jump into them, and that there's so much to learn from indigenous care practices and stewardship. And one place we've heard that a lot lately in the US where I am is with regards to fire and fire management on the West Coast, where it's becoming well recognized that, if we had indigenous fire management practices, we wouldn't be in this situation. And so people are starting to think about, everything from fire management to cultivation, and what can be learned. And I think maybe that makes it less intimidating to think about some of the political and economic dimensions of land return. It can help. I mean, it's challenging.
Yeah,
Sure.
no, precisely. I think that's exactly what I was hoping you would say, is because I had also heard a bit about that, the fire management techniques being a specific example of where we can actively learn more and apply that learning. So, yeah, so I think there is hope, I think. And we have a question, I think, on the social media side.
Yeah. Hi, Holly. We've got a question from Jarl, actually. And the question is what the role of fiction is in your work and also in your book After Geoengineering. Did you hear? Yeah,
so I used fiction to help imagine what some of these possible futures would like, because I wanted to get at the idea that there's a multiplicity of futures, and what that future is like doesn't inhere in the technology. It adheres in the choices that are made about how the technology is developed and what's the policy around it. And so I think that not just fiction, but art and design too can make visible the social and emotional contexts of the use of these technologies. And that it can help us understand that there are design choices rather than just kind of like a menu of objects that you pick and put in your shopping cart. And so I used fiction because that was the medium I had closest at hand. But I think there's a huge role for a whole bunch of other medium and fields to engage with this.
Do we have anybody here in the audience who maybe would like to pose a quick question? It's a little dark, so it's hard for me to see little hands popping up, but if you do, just, I see one in the center here, actually. Is Jarl there with the microphone?
As in, you were just talking about like indigenous firefighting practices, but the way you described it to me kind of sounded like appropriating those practices instead of actually decolonizing the system and including everyone. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on that and how we can do that in a truly inclusive and decolonized way.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. That's very like learning from versus actually returning land are, I mean, two different things, right? Because of the circles I'm in with more policy-oriented people, I'm thinking about how to take them from one place to another. Not that it's my job to take anybody anywhere, but like as a communicator and educator, you know, if you think about this idea of actually returning land and think about how somebody who's where they are now, how do you bring them there? I think the first step is showing them what you can learn. So I didn't mean that should be an ending point, but just the beginning point on somebody's journey for thinking about what would a world where land was actually returned be like, and showing them that could be a really positive place and not an intimidating place, just because of the politics in the US are so dominated by this narrative that there's been some kind of loss, you know, the Make America Great Again thing. And people are so afraid of losing more. And so somebody who works in rural areas in the US, I think, and, you know, regularly talks to people who are going to vote for somebody like Trump, I'm thinking about there's enough people out there like that we have to figure out how to bring some of them along, I think. I hope that answered some of your question at least.
Yeah, and I mean, to follow on from that question, I think there is a need to bring people along, and it's kind of, some of us are really actively working for justice movements, and we're actively concerned with these things, and then there are, as you mentioned, the people who you suspect might vote for Trump in the next election. We have to work together on all these things. I think that's, I guess, one of the main takeaways, is that we have to find a way to be constructive. Are there any other questions in the audience or from anyone else? Because then maybe we can move on to the next speaker, and we have a big Q&A at the end, so it's not like the end of the questions. All right, then let's move on, shall we? All right. So our next speaker is Tega Brain, who is an artist and engineer, and I think she's right over my shoulder here. Hello. Hi.
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 Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Can you?
So I'll get started.
Oh, yep, sure.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to share my screen.
Let's make sure that works.
Let's just make sure this works okay. Okay, and then if I do this, how is that? Are you seeing my slides?
Yeah, we're seeing the presenter view.
Oh, you're seeing the presenter view. Okay, let me see if I can change that. Okay, one more try. How about now?
That's perfect, yep.
Okay, great. We did it.
go.
Excellent. Brilliant. Okay, yes. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. And also to be in conversation with you, Holly. I'm a big admirer of your work as well. So I'm going to share a series of projects that I've done over the last few years that are more concerned with questions of automation, artificial intelligence, outsourcing environmental decision-making to machines. And I want to start with a work that was done in 2019 called Asunder. And this project has been shown in a few places like Transmediale and was commissioned by the Vienna Museum of Design. And it responds to the growing interest in the application of AI to manage environmental challenges. And it situates this as a literal proposal. And so what you're looking at is a sort of fictional autonomous environmental manager that proposes, simulates, and then models future alterations to Earth's surface. And in doing, in developing these scenarios, it produces what are often completely unacceptable or absurd results. So the work combines machine learning techniques. So when I talk about artificial intelligence, I'm talking about machine learning. And it also uses traditional climate modeling, so traditional environmental modeling. And so as part of the work, we worked with Landsat satellite tiles, and we trained a GAN, a machine learning system, on Landsat tiles using an infilling technique to generate geoengineering proposals for different parts of the world. So here you see on the left a region of the Arctic, and the proposal that you're seeing is for this region to be also like farmed for agriculture. Here is one relevant since we are in the Netherlands. So on the left, you see historic tiles of a stretch of coastland. And on the right, you see our system's proposition for building barrier islands offshore on this piece of coastland. And so the work cycles through various parts of the world, generating options for regions, and then modeling what these changes would do in terms of changes to Earth's system. And so it really probes narratives around automating decision-making, exploring the evocative idea of distributing agency to machines in how we manage environments. And this is an idea that is endlessly fascinating, I think. This question of, what are the possibilities and pitfalls of distributing agency in this way? This question also mobilizes a number of predicaments, of course. Predicaments like our need to respond to the climate emergency on an infrastructural level, as Holly's just spoken about, with planetary scale management, carbon capture. And then on the other hand, we need to be very critical and wary of hubristic techno solutions to planetary challenges, especially when these have a tendency to overlook the economic and political origins of these issues, and how so much of the climate crisis emerges and is entwined with histories of colonialism and the system of, the economic system that we're in. So if environmental problems are the result of sort of a techno-capitalism, are we going to be able to address them with these same tools that have emerged from this system? And so I'm also very interested in like how we see environments and how computers and technologies encourage certain perspectives and blind us and take away other perspectives. How computing suggests certain conceptual frameworks, like the idea that the environment is a system, and how this then produces certain pathways for action. And this question of how we see environments is also very much explored in this work that sort of puts two different modeling techniques side by side, right? So you have a machine learning technique that is statistical, it's looking for patterns, it's based on correlation, not based on theory or an understanding of the systems that it's looking at. And we place this alongside an actual climate model, which is built from science, built from theory, and uses, physics and chemistry to produce a simulation of the world. And so this climate model we used was a community Earth system model, and it runs on this computer in the gallery, right, which is a sort of 144 CPU computer. And this is what's being used to sort of model the scenarios we generate. So I'm sort of interested in how these different approaches to understanding the world, what sort of results they produce and what sort of paths to action they produce. And so, with the climate model, of course, we can, this is interpretable. We can trace every parameter back to original scientific work. And this is not the case in machine learning. So, you're just seeing on the screen a few parameters that have come from the atmospheric component of the model that we ended up using. And so, there's this stunning amount of hype around machine learning that we've seen over the last few years. And increasingly, we're seeing it deployed and used and experimented with to deal with environmental challenges. And on screen, you see a great deal of research going on into automation of environmental management using AI. Google is partnering with climate labs. Microsoft has launched AI for Earth and is giving support to environmental researchers who want to apply machine learning in their work. We're starting to hear about smart forest projects and robotics used to manage different species populations in different ways. So this might take the form of like culling invasive species or promoting desirable species through drone reseeding or use of virtual fences and so on. And so, what are the things we need to consider if we look at this future of applying automation in the context of environmental management? Why is it such an evocative idea? And so I think this is the case for many reasons. Firstly, as landscape architect Bradley Cantrell observes, the Anthropocene by definition means that the definition of wilderness as being the absence of human influence is sort of no longer, it has shifted, right? And the definition of wilderness now is more being understood as one of automation, where wilderness is about maintaining automated ecological processes. It's about minimizing human intervention. And paradoxically, this means a lot of spaces today are being carefully managed. So this is, the largest sort of cat-proof fence in Australia, right? That is sort of protecting an area of wilderness from feral cats, which is like a massive problem in Australia. When I'm talking about automation, this can occur at various stages. It can occur at the perception at the moment of data collection. It can occur in data analysis stage. It can occur at the decision-making stage, so by selecting actions. And then it can also occur at actuation, right, which is, the robotics and the virtual fences and so forth. And so, does applying automation at any of these stages help us produce novel wilderness situations? And this is something that landscape architects like Cantrell are really considering. And so this question of what it means to automate decision-making is already at play in the context of the smart city and the smart home. Historian Arif Kornweitz has written extensively on the concept of smartness. as an approach to management and governance. And I think there are some lessons here. You know, Halpern observes that the contemporary impulse to counter precarity and a response to crisis has been with computation and automation. You know, she says where others might see the growing precariousness of human populations to be countered by conscious planning and regulation, advocates for smartness see opportunities to decentralize agency and intelligence by distributing it among objects, networks, and life forms. So where did this idea come from? She traces some of this history of this like imaginary for smartness, looking back to a moment in 2008 when Sam Palmisano, the CEO of IBM, argued that in the midst of the economic crisis of 2008, that this should be addressed with the idea of building a smarter planet, right? So this was really a moment where this idea of smartness was mobilized. And you can see here an image of IBM's Smarter Planet campaign, and I'll just quickly read you the opening paragraph. So our political leaders are not the only ones who have been handed a mandate for change. Leaders of businesses and institutions everywhere have a unique opportunity to transform the way the world works. And so, you know, I think what's clear here is that smartness is seen as an approach to ultimately to governance, right? And it's being framed as a tool to respond to crisis and precarity and an increasingly uncertain future. And one could say it's a way to privatize both infrastructure and governmental processes as well. In the words of Halpern again, you know, smartness is both a reality and an imaginary, and this commingling underwrites both its logic and the magic of its popularity. It encourages everything to be seen as software, so then everything becomes iterative, it's never finished. And it's also uniquely equipped to deal with critique, right? Critique, in fact, provides a means to perpetuate an endless optimization in smart systems. You know, and this process of optimization is the process through which it operates, right? Constant iteration, constant response to a changing situation. It's like sort of a subscription model to governance in a while, right? In a way, right? Where there's rolling updates and the project is never truly finished. And so recently, I did a project that looked at some of the history of smartness and particularly looking at the history of IBM, right, who has been central to this project. And this was a short film that I did with collaborators Sam Levine and Hannah Gianti. And we visited Endicott, which is a site in northern New York State where IBM began. And it's, you know, it's a telling history, right? So this is an abandoned place. It's the IBM Country Club. So in a way, it's sort of like the first tech campus. And it is the place where a lot of technologies used in the Holocaust were developed. And it is also a place now that is a Superfund site, right? So the legacy of IBM, now they've left town, they're no longer active in the town, has left this legacy of pollutants and volatile organic compounds that the community is dealing with and that have caused a public health crisis in this area. The chemicals are in the groundwater, and so the community is sort of breathing them in as they evaporate into the houses in the community. And so these sorts of Superfund sites exist across the US. And I think when we talk about AI and when we talk about smartness or algorithmic governance, we also have to talk about this as part of the story, right? These chemical legacies, the fact that these technologies, these sensors, 5G, the cloud, automated decision makings, they rely on very old industrial processes of extraction. They rely on child labor, they rely on coltan mined in the Congo, you know, and communities across the world are dealing with the birth defects and public health issues as a result of this, right? So this is not something that is often talked about by the proponents of these systems. Prediction, smartness, automated decision makings exist with this material reality. So as smartness shows us, computation renders the environment visible to us and operationalizes it in very specific ways. Armed with a computer, the world appears as data and the environment as a system to be optimized. So optimization, the act of making the best or most efficient use of a situation or resource, central concept to engineering. But like, what is best? What is most effective? Who gets to decide? Optimization is not neutral. It's a process that can only occur after values have been articulated, set, and prioritized. And perhaps this is why it seems so often to mask and obscure the politics that it enacts. There's a brilliant scholar, Danielle Allen, she's a political scholar, and she muses that, about why engineers are often apolitical or have trouble reading the politics of their work. They're brilliant at optimization, and it's the operation by which, engineering addresses the world, but it often it leaves one ill-equipped to deal with the step before optimization, which is the ordering of values, the messiness of politics, dealing with these conflicts that are hard to resolve. So finally, I'm going to conclude just with sharing one more project, and this work is called Deep Swamp, and it is very much concerned with these questions of optimization and distributing agency. It takes the form of a big installation that consists of 3 wetland systems that are each managed by an artificially intelligent software agent. And I called these agents Nicholas, Hans, and Harrison. They take photos of their environments, and based on the photos, they can adjust the conditions within them. They can change light, water flow, fog, nutrients, and each tries to engineer its environment for a different goal. So every few minutes it takes a photo, and then it makes decisions based on analyzing this photo with an image classifier. It uses a deep learning approach, and each wetland and its software has learned what an environment looks like by passing thousands of images tagged and categorized from online image collections. The software I used was initially trained using ImageNet. So ImageNet is a database of images scraped from the internet, categorized by Mechanical Turk workers. And it's a very common image set used in computer vision, machine learning purposes. And then I trained the final layer with different categories of images. So one of my wetlands is trying to understand what an environment looks like based on images of natural wetlands that is scraped from Flickr. And so it's trying to optimize its environment based on its appearance, trying to match it to what it believes a natural wetland looks like from this image collection. Hans, the second wetland, is trying to produce a work of landscape painting. It's only ever been exposed to images of landscape painting from the history of Western art. These images were scraped from the Google Art Project. And the third one, Nicholas, is trying to optimize for gallery goers. It's trying to attract an audience. It has only seen images with people in it. And so when it takes a photo and it has people in it, these sorts of settings get reinforced in how it manages its environment. So over and over, each agent tries new combinations of settings to optimize its environment for its programmatic desire. Always iterating, never finished, the work outsources agency to these data-driven systems that have produced knowledge based on image data sets and the patterns within them. It has no understanding of the internal processes of each environment, whether the plants live or die, so long as they appear in the image of what it understands an environment to be. And so here, intelligence and agency emerges from these data sets. And these data sets are produced from a cultural context, right? These data sets are produced by people taking photographs of environments, how environments become legible to these photographers. And so they're very culturally specific. And so when we talk about machine learning as being potentially more objective than other ways of decision making, I think we have to bear this in mind, that the data sets that it is reliant on are produced in very specific contexts. And this is something that I've been interested in for a long time. So an older work that I did called Keeping Time in 2013 was concerned with similar questions. It involves scraping images from Flickr for particular plant species, and then taking these thousands of images and ordering them according to timestamp, with the question of, could I see different events in these species' lives? So this is a flowering event, based on what they looked like from the perspective of photographers on Flickr, right? And so the images are laid out chronologically, and each row is a different year. So here you see 2002 to 2013, January is on the left and December on the right. So you see this very like, the plant comes into flower in November. And this is what the jacaranda looks like. And so what this work showed me was, I initially started it because I was interested in how phenology, how flowering patterns show up in these sort of messy social databases. But what became more interesting was that they are really images of how we see environments, right? What moments species become visible to us. So this is the aspen, and you can see that there are a lot of images at the moments where it changes color, right? Where there's this sort of like spectacular moment in its life cycle. And so this project is as much about the way these species, the timing of events in these species' lives, as the way we actually see them. And ritual and culture is so much a part of that. So, I did, one of the images was about the bluebonnet in Texas, and Texans have this tradition of going into the fields and taking photos when this plant comes into flower. And thus, there are thousands of photos at this moment of flowering. And so all of our methods of seeing, observing, and sensing life forms on this planet are partial and incomplete. And this is key when if we are to take seriously the idea of automating environmental management and the idea of outsourcing environmental agencies to data-driven technologies. And so this question of, what are the promises and pitfalls of using machine learning in the context of environmental management? I think AI offers us another way of seeing and building an understanding of environment, but it is limited, just like all of our methods are. AI relies on data, and we only have so much data. We have limited rainfall records. We have limited information about other species. Machine learning is also conservative. It assumes the past is indicative of the future. And this is an assumption that we know is not going to be the case in the context of climate change. We know that environments can change in nonlinear ways and unpredictable ways, and that we are at risk of crossing climate tipping points that have not been experienced by humans before. And finally, there's this argument that AI offers a way to distribute agency in ways that are less political than human decision-making. And given that many of these technologies are developed in affluent, homogenous communities, often in the US, I think we have to be critical of this claim to depoliticize decision-making. And we have to sort of reckon with, the histories of colonialism and inequality that have brought these problems about and that are imbued in these technologies as well. And I think I'll leave it there. I think I have gone to time. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right, thank you. Great.
Great.
Thanks very much. You talked a bit about the cost of smartness and about the physical costs that we often kind of don't think about, and also the potential social costs when smartness becomes a kind of method of governance. Do you think as we become more aware of these things, we can do something to combat these costs, or are they basically baked in and very difficult to separate?
I mean, I think they're very difficult to separate. I don't think there's a, version of computing that can separate itself from the industrial processes that are demanded, in producing these systems. But I do think we need a sort of more tempered relationship with computation. Computation isn't necessarily the answer to a lot of the situations we will face and are facing. I think there are movements towards minimal computing or using computing and data in a much more, less hubristic way. I think it's more about deciding what we want to use computation for and what we don't.
Yeah, and I mean, so to sort of follow on a little, do you think that there's potentially ways we can collaboratively develop more non-extractive ways of doing things that are realistic to you and that might apply and be part of, for example, some of your work?
Sure. I mean, we can like reuse devices. We can, I think there's a lot of work that can be done on the software side of things, which means we don't necessarily have to be in this perpetual loop of constantly like updating and replacing our machines every few years. I mean, I guess I'm talking on a consumer scale here. I think there's a lot of change that could be made to really have a different relationship with computation that's sort of much less materially impactful. Obviously, that is a very like complicated conversation that involves a lot more than just one wanting to having this intention or wanting to make this decision. Yeah.
I guess I'm also prodded on this train of thought a little bit by watching an exchange between some artists on Twitter talking about using, crypto methods in their work and feeling guilty about it because it takes so much computing power, and that they were kind of refraining from doing that because of that. And then someone chimed in with, well, one of these crypto methods, I forget which one now, is changing to proof of stake, so it will be a lot less taxing, and then we can feel a lot better about this kind of thing. Is that, but are these, I was tempted to think in the moment, this is maybe also just hopeful to think that just reducing it to proof of stake is actually enough. I wonder if you could comment maybe on this kind of, this bargaining that we might do as creative people with the tools that we're making and trying to actively enact change and hope for change and prod for change in how the tools are the nature of their use, let's say, and how extractive or impactful they are. Not to put you on the spot or anything, but
It's a great conversation, right? Because it's a huge dilemma in the media arts, right? Yeah. On one hand, we are making claims of criticality. We are making claims that, we are showing like a more critical view of these technologies, countering the Silicon Valley narratives and so forth. On the other hand, I think we're all guilty of work that sort of continues to like furnish the imagination for computation, right? Mm-hmm. And I this is a conversation that I have with a lot of my colleagues, and it's definitely something that keeps me up at night, in that even in trying to have a critical engagement with these things, are we just actually, pointing out their flaws to those people who are developing them at scale and giving them the chance to, address the fact that facial recognition doesn't work on all types of faces or so forth? Are we just doing free R&D, which means that, the technologies can be patched and become more palatable? Are we furthering an imagination for AI, for these sort of like concerning futures? And so I think we do have a responsibility as creatives and artists to also pay attention to other ways of knowing the world and other forms of intelligence, right? And other agencies that we very much live with and exist with, and that, produce protocols that we live by, that just maybe we haven't spent as much attention on or like thought about as much. I think this is a big conversation that's definitely happening in the sort of computational art space now, which is what sort of work is our work doing what we say it is? What is it matching the claims we're making?
Yeah, exactly. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to maybe ask a question, or do we have anybody on social media also asking things?
We can take a question, please. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the great presentation. I believe your work is pretty inspiring. So I want to bring up the question that, I think we are at this moment that we should stress about the data sets and like how they're produced, because basically the code can be fascist. A code can be racist as well. You know, there are many applications they don't recognize colored people, for example. So at this point, I would like to ask, for example, with the data image scraping from that website, is like what we see, what image we scrape is like more like the popular image, for example. And the popular, that manipulates the output at the end, and it's not the best for the environment maybe. And on the other hand, this is a system we know, and if we're going through the image, and if we're making the machine learning through the image that from that system, maybe we're going to a kind of repeated behavioral pattern, which leads us to the same feature at the end, but an alternative one, a different one. So I would like to ask your opinions about it. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think you're speaking to the way that all data sets are biased, that all data sets emerge from a specific context and a specific cultural moment. And I mean, that's very much the inquiry that I was trying to make with the Deep Swamp project, right? Which is in carefully like curating the data sets that each environment was using to assess its own performance. I was trying to explore this question of, like the very idea of how we understand nature or how we see environments is so specific to, you know, where we've grown up, who we are, what experiences we've had through our lives, and that there isn't this sort of like one objective perspective that can be sort of reached. You know, and this is a conversation that I think is sort of, and an argument that's sort of well developed in the machine learning space right now, where, like in the context of facial recognition or the way that machine learning has been used in law enforcement in the US, you know, there's been a lot of studies that have revealed, right, that these systems perpetuate historic biases that exist in their training data. And any claims being made that they depoliticize decision-making or that they help us escape these histories are just basically false, right? So we can't talk about these systems without talking about the data they've been trained on. And this is just the limitation of this technology, right? It doesn't provide us with a holistic view ever.
Great.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question? Do we have some questions from our audience, or do we have everything to add, Rianne?
Yes, we do have one from Ben Bogart. I'm not sure how to pronounce. He says, one second, he says, does using a relational view like agential realism solve some of these problems where objects are materially and culturally constructed in relation through interaction that creates boundaries? And to kind of expand on that, he says, both the disconnection of tech from resource use and the relation between data and resulting models.
I'm not sure if I fully can deal with that question, but I do think, I think what we call artificial intelligence is a very narrow version of intelligence, right? And there's a lot of other ways we could approach what we understand that to be. And one of those could be a much more sort of relational, social perspective, where it's not so much about historic data sets, but it's emergent from interaction and from a social context. And I think there's really interesting work happening in the sort of, it's come up already, the like decolonizing design space, right? Where we're seeing also the limits to like developing these technologies within the context of, you know, Western science, Western thought, right? And like the narrow definitions of intelligence and the artificial that come about in those histories and in that context, you know. And if we look to other cultures and other contexts, that opens up different ideas of what intelligence might be and how agency might play out. So I do think we need like multitude of voices and perspectives in here, and I'm really excited about the work happening in that particular space as well.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Tega. And also just a little sidebar program note, we want to also thank the new Institute for bringing you into the fold here as part of the visitors program. And if you would like to hear Tega speak some more, she's speaking at an event called Climate Imaginaries on the 29th with Framer Framed, the Goethe Institute, and Fiber. So thank you, Tega. And now we're going to move on to our final speaker of this evening's program, Arif Kornweitz. And you're a researcher and designer with a very interesting background. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and then share with us your presentation. Welcome.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I have a background in conflict resolution, so political science.
Yeah.
But I also teach at the Rietveld Academy here. So I'm not really a designer, actually, but
okay.
I think...
The internet lies.
Yeah, but no, I mean, not to correct you, but I think I do teach at the design lab, and I always learn a lot from the students there, so maybe I will become one someday.
Infected with design, yes.
Yeah, I just this year joined KIM, which is a research group on artificial intelligence and media philosophy in Karlsruhe, the University of Arts and Design, to write a PhD on the use of artificial intelligence, so AI, in humanitarianism. So kind of linking back a little bit to my background in conflict resolution. And that's also what I've been invited to talk about. And I hope it will connect to the previous talks. I do think so. So yeah, I think I'll speak for like 20 minutes and
Perfect.
Then we'll see.
Yeah.
So Tega has already said that AI mostly refers to machine learning, right? I think it's worth repeating that. So essentially, machine learning means training a machine to do certain tasks by itself, and hopefully then faster and more efficient than humans can. And what that means for the use of AI in humanitarianism is that in a way, the technology that, oh no, I'm seeing myself. I'm not sure what to do with this computer, maybe. I'm speaking about AI, right? I do have some slides we don't see at the moment. I'll just continue.
Yes. Yeah.
So, very broadly speaking, do we see these slides now? I see them. I hope you see them as well. Oh, okay, we'll figure it out. So, essentially, these algorithms, these machine learning algorithms that are used to, for example, I don't know, classify your photos on Facebook, are somewhat comparable to the technology that's starting to be used in humanitarianism. So, for example, to deliver food aid to people in refugee camps. So I want to talk about that by speaking about two terms, mission creep and function creep, you see on the slides right now. And both terms are about unintended consequences. So mission creep is the unintended broadening of a scope of a mission, of a humanitarian mission, also a military mission. So that means when a mission takes longer or involves more tasks than was initially planned for. And function creep then is the unintended broadening of a function of a software. So for example, when data in a database that's, for example, meant for shopping is suddenly also used for something else, to predict your health patterns, something like that. So I'll clarify that in a bit, but I think I just want to give kind of an intro to humanitarianism, so I'll say a bit more about that. And generally what we mean by humanitarianism is kind of the field of organizations and actions that respond to humanitarian crises or disasters. And that includes large organizations, so for example, the Red Cross, United Nations World Food Programme, but there are also lots of small advocacy organizations that want to change certain issues or want to work towards certain groups. And what kind of combines the field and what guides humanitarian action is a set of ethics and values that these organizations adhere to. So generally, they aim to act according to impartiality, neutrality, and humanity. And then there are these imperatives, ethical imperatives, such as do good and first do no harm. They're also, you might know them from medical ethics. So these actors want to do good, but they want to provide aid, but they face this challenge of not doing harm while they do good, right? And so, yeah, they respond to emergencies such as armed conflicts, epidemics, pandemics, famines, or natural disasters. And these crises, as you can imagine, are often intertwined. So you can imagine that floods lead to failed harvests and food insecurity, as, for example, we see right now in Sudan, where there are floods, and Sudan has a recent history of civil war. So that's the delicate context, right? So people lose their homes, food prices are increased. And in these moments, humanitarian organizations come in and they respond by supplying food aid, medical support, but also increasingly cash. So we're going abstract in a way. So this field is full of statistics, and I want to give you some numbers of the United Nations Refugee Agency, which estimates that there are almost 80 million displaced people worldwide at the end of last year, 2019. 26 million of these are refugees, so they left their own country of origin. 6.6 million of those are Syrian, 5.6 million are Palestinian, 3.7 million are from Venezuela. More than 45 million people have been displaced internally, so that means that they have been forced to flee within their own country. Then 80% of these 80 million displaced people are affected by food insecurity or malnutrition, and a lot of them live in camps. And so you can imagine that these crises, some of them are new, some of them are old and very prolonged, and there's a lot of different needs, and the task of delivering aid to these populations is incredibly complex and difficult because logistics and politics are entangled. And if we think back to the ethical imperative of first do no harm, that's why that is very difficult, right? And that sector, humanitarian sector, knows that, and they certainly know it since the 1980s when the Ethiopian famine made that clear, because the famine corresponded with clashes of armed groups and the government, and the camps set up by humanitarian organizations were then used by the government and by groups to move so-called vulnerable populations around the country. And food aid was being sold to buy weapons. And so, in the words of the president back then, the president of Doctors Without Borders, Brauman, the sector realized that aid can kill. So, okay, here we are. The sector knows that its actions are not neutral. And that's a major problem. And that's one of the reasons why today they look to humanitarian technologies or humanitarian information activities as a solution. And AI is one of them. So, for example, material relief is now increasingly distributed digitally or by text message, so essentially by sending cash. And aid logistics are increasingly organized with the help of data analytics, also of machine learning, so to understand where goods need to go when. And refugees in camps are often forced to use biometrics, such as iris scans, in order to get access to aid and to identify themselves, which is a topic that Ariana Dongus at Kim in Karlsruhe writes about, and I will just share a slide with all my references in the end. So technology like AI, that's the hope, could be able to help this sector by organizing more efficiently, by being more neutral also. If you already heard, that is a problematic idea, right? And it's problematic because the functions and effects of a technology are difficult to predict and control, as Tega has just said. And that's especially true for humanitarian or disaster settings because they change really quickly, they're often highly contested, there's violence. And so this idea that technology can somehow interfere in a controlled way is very suspect. So, and that's where mission creep basically comes in. And this term, as I said before, is also a military term, and it means the broadening of a humanitarian mission, right? So suddenly it will involve more tasks than was initially planned, or it takes longer. And I want to look at this term a bit more closely. So first of all, creep. Now, let me try to change the slide like this. Thank you. Cool. So Creep refers to slow widening of a material. For example, a glacier slowly moves, so the ice crystals actually slowly flow, they expand, or the glacier expands. And that movement is too slow for us to see, but it's the result of a million small reactions. So we could say that creep describes a phenomenon that is ongoing, it's a dynamic, but it's not always immediately visible, but it leads to a deformation. So then we have the term mission, right, mission creep, which is a bit more telling, and it evokes the Christian missionaries who went to spread Christianity, and it evokes the West's civilizing missions, which, to recall, were used to justify Western colonialism and the exploitation of a lot of those countries that are now subjected to humanitarian intervention. And these civilizing missions were aimed at spreading Western values, including a belief in economical advancement through technological innovation, and Western understandings of what constitutes art or what constitutes science. So, in other words, what intelligence is. And these understandings of intelligence they were used to justify this extraction, and they were used to justify violence against indigenous people. And even international law, which is a key anchor point of humanitarian action, has its origin in colonization and extraction. It was developed in the 16th century by the scholars of the School of Salamanca, who set up a distinction between public law and private ownership. And that provided a legal language and a framework to deal with the indigenous people the Spanish colonizers encountered. And so they basically set up property rights and contracts this justified, or you could say legalized, this power relationship. And Martin Koskinen writes about this really interestingly. So I have a slide with references. Okay, so today, humanitarianism still is not neutral. As A.L. Weitzman describes, it goes hand in hand with military intervention. It takes place in zones that are imposed on areas of conflict, like camps. It is financed by Western governments in order to contain displaced people, for migration control, to keep them at the borders. And it is, as Weitzman says, woven into the global network of commodity circulation through the products of aid. So, very briefly, but this is the backdrop against which we should understand the deployment of AI in humanitarianism. So it's an extension of the history of missions and the history of using the concept of intelligence to classify people and to exercise control. And effectively, the deployment of AI and humanitarian action, this exports and reinforces techno-capitalist values, similar to how these missions promoted Western belief systems, in order to define borders and values. So if we look at it like that, then the term mission creep stands for the wrongful expectation that missions can be defined, that we're able to limit a mission to a certain goal to stay in control, and that every exception and unexpected consequences is something to be corrected, right? It's an anomaly. All right, so then we have AI, which kind of brings up another issue, because as we have already heard, AI is not all that artificial and also not all that intelligent. So to speak about the artificiality briefly, this has been said, right? And probably we know, but it's worth repeating that machine learning models, training them requires a lot of energy and a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. And there's a great article by Roel Dobbe and Meredith Whittaker about this. So this puts the application of AI in disaster relief in a different light, right? Because the development of AI plays a role in climate change. Might be a small role at the moment, but it just means that there is a trade-off, and that there's not like a simple effect vector pointing in one way. So the technology is not just its function, but it sits in the world in a way. And AI just not just exists, but it needs to be built and trained. And the people who profit from that at the moment are overwhelmingly white and Western, whereas there's a lot of ghost work or Amazon Mechanical Turk work involved, which often takes place in formerly colonized places, so in coloniality, or it takes place as low-wage work. So again, that's a continuation of the pattern of extraction and inequality, but that's obscured again by the functionality of the technology. And there's a good article also called Decolonial AI by Shakir Mohammed and others. But okay, so AI really is not very artificial and also maybe not that intelligent, because AI systems can ever only process and classify the world according to the rules implemented into them at the engineering phase. That might be dynamic now, but still you could see that as a repetition of this colonial gesture of reduction, right? And Gillian Hadfield is a law scholar who likens this process to strictly adhering to an economical contract or a law, so strictly following a set of rules without understanding the implicit agreements in them. So kind of very different to how we think about the law or contract, because there's a lot that we don't write down that is not mentioned, but that's clear from the context and the subtext of a contract for us. And Matteo Pasquinelli writes that an AI is mostly unable to understand unique anomalies, so that it cannot understand new exceptions and in turn cannot invent a new metaphor. And this matters because in conflict and humanitarianism, these unique anomalies occur all the time, right? So again, that's what the first do no harm principle is about. And these unique situations need custom judgment every time to prevent harm. And anomalies there are not just glitches in data, but they are real people. And if we understand these anomalies merely from an engineering perspective, as like a design problem to solve, then the danger is reducing evil to error. So an algorithm does not fully comprehend the world in its dynamic becoming. And just like law and contracts, code and models presuppose a certain world, but the world always manifests itself in new ways. So coincidentally, in the tech sector, there is also a term for unintended effects, as I said in the beginning. That's function creep. And that's, again, the broadening of the functionality of a database or software. So a classic example would be that a company regulates access to their doors with key cards, and all workers have a key card to get into the office. But then you use the access logs to control basically who works what hours. So the function is security, but it kind of creeps to involve control. In the case of humanitarianism, this can become a bit more dangerous because an AI, for example, may know or may understand to a certain extent that the data set of a refugee population needs to be anonymized so that there are no names in the data set. But logistics data, that's a common data for aid supply, can still include metadata that allows identifying vulnerable populations. For example, logistics data of food aid can be used to infer where mothers are located. And if a government does not want refugees to give birth in their country, that information can be used for targeting, as Linda Raftery writes in a post about the partnership of the United Nations World Food Programme with the intelligence and defense firm Palantir. And Palantir, as you may know, has deep ties with the CIA and the US military. It's founded by Peter Thiel, the PayPal founder, who is a known libertarian, and it was actually funded literally with CIA money. There were rumors that it helped find bin Laden, but definitely they're helping like predicting attacks on US forces, right? So this is a defense company to a certain extent. So you can imagine that this partnership is difficult for several reasons. And one of the examples given, also by Raftery, is that so essentially 8 organizations like the World Food Programme are very large, and they partner with local organizations to distribute food aid. And then often they have to provide data of what they call their beneficiaries to the World Food Programme, and that gets fed into a database called Scope. And so when this partnership of Palantir, this defense firm, and the WFP launched, it was not clear whether Palantir would have access to this database called Scope. And the Syrian Red Crescent workers on the ground then freaked out, basically, because they were afraid that the Assad government could essentially say that they are supplying data to the CIA. And then they feared for their lives, right? So it's not just a technical issue, but it becomes very political very quickly in this sector. And yeah, that post by Lina Raftery is great, so please look it up. And yeah, so in both fields, there's this term for unwanted effects, and they're coming together in this application of AI and humanitarianism. And these terms both express kind of an expectation of stability and an understanding of instability as the exception. And what I find interesting is maybe to ask how we can look beyond this expectation of stability, and also beyond kind of the categorization of instability, to stick a bit with the theme. So beyond the goals of a mission or the functions of a technology. So how can we understand the technology as being part of a world that always changes, and that's as something that produces exclusions but also offers possibilities for change? And as one possible answer, and that actually might be a response to that question about agential realism, I want to share with you this metaphor of diffraction that Karen Barad writes about, that she borrowed also from Donna Haraway. And diffraction is basically wave interference, and it enables us to see how a phenomenon interacts with another phenomenon. So in this graphic you see A and B kind of emitting these waves, and they have different interference patterns, right? And so you could say that those are the effects of difference, how they play out over time and also in space, right? The drawing is a sketch of Thomas Young of the observation of water waves and interference from 1801. But yeah, this metaphor also invokes the slow flow of a creeping material of the glacier, how it's expanding in time and space because of these million small interactions leading to small changes. And so creep, change and deformation actually is not the exception, like function or mission creep imply, but it's the modus operandi of any phenomenon and any technology. So, to conclude, the use of AI in humanitarianism then is not a question of functionality, of successful missions versus mission creep. And it's not a question of getting the calculation right, because again, as Barad writes, I'll just scroll through, ethics is not a calculation. It's about responding and being responsible in each moment, in every cut. And so closely looking at these moments of mission creep and function creep then may allow us to lay bare the history and workings of humanitarianism, of AI, in order to understand what responding and what responsibility look like. So that's it, and then I have the references for you.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Wow. Yeah, so I think something you said that really jumped out was reducing evil to error. And I think that's something that really strikes at the heart of what you were talking about in a way, since we can always excuse it away if the algorithm did it or the AI did it or whatnot. But of course, these things were authored by us. And the portrait that you paint leads me to think that maybe the one solution is simply that AI is only a tool that could really never be used without heavy human correction in order to ensure that that evil doesn't become just an error that's swept away. Is that am I being too pessimistic about the possibility of it to develop, or what are your thoughts?
I think then you're thinking about this idea of singularity, so like AI becoming completely autonomous, which I think we're very far off. I think at the moment it is a very human technology in a way. There are some, to a certain extent, autonomous interactions there, but I don't really see how it is independent at the moment. So,
no, but we might, like blame it or say it's already happening. I guess that I didn't do it. The algorithm came out with this bad result, and sorry, sorry you got profiled, and now you're in jail. Whoops, blame something else. So we have to take, I guess, a kind of responsibility for the tools that we make. But yeah, I mean, of course, nothing is.
No, you're completely right. It's outsourcing accountability basically to the algorithm, and also creating distance towards decision making in in a similar way as distance is being created towards the subject of humanitarian action, right, by these technologies. Yeah.
So in the area that you're looking at, and specifically uniting this technology with humanitarian work, and this distance, and you see the danger of it, and you articulate it quite clearly. How do you shorten that distance then? What can be done to kind of mitigate that and bring it back closer again?
Yeah, it's nice that you use this term of shortening the distance, right? Because I think there's this quote by Bauman who says, like, we have shortened spatiotemporal distance by developing technology, so we can now have a conference on Zoom with people in the US, right? But then he's saying, like, we can't, our moral distance has not been shortened at the same time. And the question is, how do we shorten that moral distance at the same time? I'm not sure if I really know the answer to that, actually.
Yeah, it's a tough one. We're not going to solve it all tonight, unfortunately. But yeah, it's something to think about in terms of, as it's out of balance perhaps now. As you say, the technological distance is shortened, but the moral one is still the one that we grapple with. Yeah. Is there anyone in the audience who wants to contribute, or on social media? 'Cause I think that's also, we can like open it up wider. And now, if anyone has any questions, maybe for the whole group.
Yeah, I have a question myself, if I may.
Okay.
To actually all of the speakers, and actually about also a conversation I had earlier with Arif. We were also talking about kind of, as you are saying in your presentation also, that AI or other technologies, in Holly's case, geoengineering, which is not a technology but like a set of developments, but that they also function to temporarily change something or reflect on something and then move beyond and see what needs to come after it, and to start working on kind of the beyond questions. And my question to all of you actually is like, and in the case also with Hollywood geoengineering, especially with your book also After Geoengineering, what can we learn from these technologies now that help us in creating kind of and implementing kind of adaptations or changes for, yeah, I would say a different future? Can you point out some of the things that you are learning now which have to be implemented after this kind of technological phase? Anyone?
There's no future, Jarl. That's the joke.
Holly, maybe you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, well, what was just discussed about creep as the modus operandi really makes you question these kind of stopgap measures. So if you think about geoengineering as this temporary stopgap that buys time for this other world to emerge, geoengineering would be subject to various types of creep, I imagine, right? I don't know if you can restrict that. I think that the challenge is to develop a discipline of thinking of the longer term, which I just don't know of any examples where a human society has done really well at that, at least contemporarily, right? And is it even fair, for us to say what kind of world should come after geoengineering, because that's the world of people 100 or 200 years from now. So I think that our task is to set up a situation in which those generations have maximum agency and maximum possibilities, and not constrain them, both on the social side and also in terms of ecosystems. So can there be a geoengineering intervention that's thinking about how to save as many species as we can for and future generations too? Yeah, it's a big question.
Thank you very much. Any others would like to respond on that?
Is the question what we can learn from technologies now? I didn't really understand the question. So.
Or what the future could be, so the post, so we make these interventions now, and then how do we move beyond and get to the next step? What could come next? What's humanitarian AI going to look like in 50 years? Yeah.
Jarl, I'm not sure that I can successfully answer this question. I have to think about it a bit, I think. I'm sorry.
No problem. Are there any questions from our audience?
Yes, we have a question from Ali Still. He says, we think we can discuss controlling AI, but some think that we're beyond that. Do you think the tech companies are far enough ahead in their own bubble to make any changes to biased outcomes and the dominant person's outlook of the world impossible? What do you think?
Is that a question to me?
to anyone who
maybe Tega wants to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of can we control AI is sort of like the same question of like, can we control corporations? Can we control the way that any technology is sort of being deployed? And I think it comes down, again, I am just really not here for a discussion about general AI or these sort of science fiction imaginaries. So I think actually, the reality of AI right now is pretty boring. It's statistical models, data sets, data centers, and patchy, bad software. Mostly that's what I see. And, it's dressed up in a really beautiful, compelling, argument and marketing sort of shell. And so I think we give too much, I think science fiction has given too much power to this sort of imaginary of a general AI or the agency that it has. So, I think the question of controlling it or we can't put it back in the bag because we can't put any technology that we have really back in the bag, right? It's out there and it is changing us and changing the world and we have to contend with it. But I think we have to also realize that it's, it's pretty stupid. And I think that's one thing, that the arts has done is that has pointed out to try to level it or to try to bring back some of those marketing narratives and show it up to be just another way of looking at the world, another way of building models. I don't know, does anyone disagree with me on the panel here?
I think that, like you said, I really agree about, the question being one of controlling corporations, right? And I think we can, and I'm really hopeful that we're at this inflection point where people are having, the techlash or whatever you want to call it against big tech platforms, and that pulls in some control. I can hope. I think social norms can shift pretty quickly in this environment because of the situation that the platforms themselves created. So maybe they'll face their own demise that way as well.
Yeah, I think what I could add is that that's probably true for both more like an ecological sector, but also the humanitarian sector, is that it's still the corporations that deploy AI or develop AI or these initiatives of Microsoft, like AI for, AI for good, let's say, all these initiatives. That's basically marketing, right? Because the money is being made with advertising and with profiling people in a very intelligent, automated way. So as long as we're aware of that, maybe there is something to be gained. Other than that, I think, it's a very dumb, very efficient technology at the moment. I totally agree with Tega.
I think the money's also being made, and this is part of the smart story, in privatizing governance, right? So these smart city projects are about, redirecting public funds into private entities. And so that's a big conversation too, that I think, AI has really bolstered that sort of business strategy, you know, and IBM is a company that's really like done that really well over the last decade. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. Then if we take it to a sort of geoengineering space, is that like, who pays for this, you know, and what sort of economic situation does it emerge from and then also reinforce? It's not just, you know, these technologies don't happen like in a vacuum.
Maybe to keep it onto governance, I think that's also kind of an interesting piece that maybe we haven't fully explored yet in terms of how are these things legislated in or out of being. And it seems to be the relationship between technology and, for example, the law is such that the law is slow, governance is slow, we have to discuss things, it takes a long time, legislation takes time to pass, and you know, by the time that happens, perhaps things have moved on. Not to keep with this shortening analogy, but how do we kind of compress the time between the response, the technological advances, and then the responses coming from the people who are ostensibly there to look after us, our, you know, our governments, our legal systems, there to protect us. Yeah. Is there any way we can kind of collapse that distance?
So to go back to the Palantir example, I think one of the ways we could do that is to look more closely at these kind of partnerships, because one of the reasons that Palantir wants to cooperate with the United Nations World Food Program is to kind of get a, you know, like a kind of different reputation, so that they actually can do work for governments and that they can do lobbying, which is what they're doing. I mean, they're supplying police, they're supplying governments. So in a way, yes, legislation is slow, the law is slow, but I think that idea of that tech innovation is always leading and that the law is following or our ethics are following, I think that's to a certain extent false, but that's also a narrative that's being propped up by these companies that want to push that. Yeah.
Maybe. I'm trying to think of an example, and I'm failing, but of where the inverse was true, where the law was ahead of the technology, or yeah. Yeah,
there are not many examples that I can think of immediately. I mean, right now there is a discussion about automated weapon systems. There seems to be, like, but again, like there are a few countries that won't sort of sit at the table, I think. So yeah, and even certain weapons that the certain conventions forbid the use of are still being used, right? So that is a difficult one.
Maybe to direct it back to you, Holly, a bit, in terms of how these technologies will roll out. I mean, and you outlined a number of scenarios, some of which sounded kind of optimistic and some of which sounded kind of more fraught. I mean, the level of international cooperation that will have to take place, I mean, this is also a governance problem. Where does that fit into your scenarios, and what do you see, what kind of tools can we use to make that happen more smoothly?
So for carbon removal, we already have the conceptual innovation of net zero as a concept that all kinds of countries and cities and companies are signing up to. And I see the evolution of that governance-wise as being very similar to the Paris Agreement, where there's bottom-up processes and every country figures out how it's going to achieve its own net zero. And it's going to be complex because countries have different capabilities of actually generating negative emissions depending on their land or their geology and so forth. So there's going to be some regime of trading and swapping, and I expect that will actually be hashed out fairly soon, because a lot of countries are working on these roadmaps to net zero by 2050 or whatever they've committed to. So we're at that point where people are actually forced to have some concrete plans about the steps there. Solar geoengineering, on the other hand, is obviously a really tricky problem. And there's a ton of literature about you know, what existing legal instruments would cover it, what international bodies could govern it. There's a proposal recently to have the UN Environmental Assembly unit, UNEP, also like evaluate geoengineering, which didn't even work, even though it was just about assessment, because different countries, like the US, for example, wanted to keep it in a more scientific arena rather than one where governance could weigh in. So that's going to be a very difficult road. And then there's a question of, will an actor do it unilaterally? Will there be a small club of countries? Could talk all day about that. But, you know, on the level of individuals, pretty much everybody agrees that it would need to be through one of these multilateral processes to work. So we'll see.
Yeah. I guess also, I mean, to bring it back, also the notions of art and design and its role in kind of allowing us the space to think creatively, how to raise awareness about some of these solutions, but also imagine how we will live with them and these kinds of things. What role does that have to play with some of the things that we've talked about tonight in terms of, making people imagine? I don't want to use the term imaginaries, but you know, the imaginaries that we could create. I will use it. Darn it. The imaginaries that we will create to enable us to see into these future steps that we need to take. Are we really discussing this enough in art and design, or do we need to take a greater role in kind of evangelizing the futures we want?
I mean, I think we all need to be working on this. Like, I think I want to see more work in art and design engaged with, you know, our carbon situation. But I also, you know, I worry that I'm interested in this sort of what we're defining as geoengineering as well. Like, to go back to the question you asked, Holly, of like, what has the pandemic taught us about the predicaments we're in? And I think what I keep thinking of is, you know, the conversation has been framed around a response to climate change too much on an individual level, probably. We then hop to a geoengineering conversation, which is very much looking at planetary, you know, infrastructural response. And for me, I think the pandemic has shown that we need both, right? I mean, we basically stopped a lot of, like, there's been massive, you know, behavior change that's happened this year. And I mean, I think the stats in the US were that the carbon footprint of everyone here has dropped like 30% or 20 something percent. I can't remember, but not enough for us to get where we need to go, right? So we need behavior change, we need culture change, we need technological change. We need to be addressing this at all of these levels. And I think art and design has a massive role to play in thinking about how we live and what matters and what a good life looks like if we're not going to rely on these sort of extraction based technologies and industries, right? Like, what does culture look like when we're doing it in a carbon neutral way and we're not justifying, like, you know, carbon emissions for some sort of like symbolic gesture? You know, and this is something that I think is really, the arts is really struggling with, right? Because we justify our work that addresses narrative and culture and symbolism, and we ignore the sort of material consequences of it, or we say that it's justified. And I think we actually really need to be talking about that and contending with it more directly, as hard as that is.
Yeah, I think it is hard, of course, for us to fully acknowledge the impact of all the things that we do and in our daily lives. And earlier in the evening, we talked about, it came up, the idea of offsetting and what a kind of failure that has been. And I think that's kind of an interesting, we have to avoid these kinds of pitfalls, I think, of lulling ourselves into thinking that we're doing something to mitigate our own activities when it's very easily corrupted. But whew, yeah, that's asking a lot of ourselves, isn't it, to always be policing all of that stuff. But I think it's possible to some degree. If anyone has any more questions in the audience, I'd love to take some, and I see someone with a hand up in the center.
Yes, another question. So we've been talking about the climate crisis and how we can solve that with technology, but I think it's also becoming increasingly clear that the climate crisis cannot be solved in a capitalist system, as capitalism is claiming ownership over everything. It's exploitative, exclusionary, like it just doesn't work. To what extent are these technologies rooted in capitalism, and what would they look like in a post-capitalist world?
Maybe I'll comment on some of that. I think that obviously the things we have at our disposal grew up through capitalism. So, you know, carbon capture and storage emerged from the fossil fuel industry. But I don't think capitalism can actually make these technologies work. I think we've seen that very clearly with carbon capture and storage in particular, but also other ones. I think that solar geoengineering too is just something that would need to be done by nation states because it's a public good, much like carbon removal is a public good. Obviously there's a lot of people who would argue quite differently and that say that, you know, solar geoengineering is a way for capitalism as usual to continue. The reason why I'm not so convinced about that is I don't think capitalism works as one unitary actor the way we talk about it sometimes. And hopefully we're at this moment where some fractions of capital that are in danger stand up to fossil capital and in particular, and they have a conflict and that can change the dynamic of it. But I think that we can think about a future that has, you know, socialist carbon removal where these industries are run by worker collectives or, you know, collectively owned like utilities. There's a lot of models that are on the table for discussion that, you know, I don't think we get to a gigaton scale of carbon removal without them. And that's the argument I make in my book anyway.
All right. Do we have any more questions from social media maybe or the audience? No?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I had one. I would like to add something what Holly was just saying. It's also quite interesting in your book that you clearly describe also that geoengineering should not be deployed under capitalism or not as the broad sense of capitalism, but it needs also a cultural and a social movement or change to make it happen and to also democratize it so it can be used kind of by, as you say, kind of collections of people or nations. I would also like to ask that question to Tega. The type of work that you're doing with machine learning and also blockchain kind of type of work, is it also these kind of developments, are they also going to benefit us if they are deployed under a different economic and political model? Do you think that would be beneficial for us?
I think it's a fascinating question. I think of some of the history of cybernetics work and like Eden Medina's book on the Chilean experiment of developing a sort of socialist cybernetic system. So there are these sort of like spots throughout, the history of computing that sort of allude to alternative moments where computation has been sort of thought through and put into the service of like other political systems or political agendas. you know, I think the way that we're sort of seeing machine learning deployed at the moment is pretty narrow, because it's something that you need institutional support for. You often need the resources of a technology company like Google or something of that scale. And so we're not seeing all like the full range of things that one could explore with these things. Like, I can imagine, using like satellite imagery analysis to identify, people who are polluting waterways, like automatically, right? And sort of doing a more like work that's about, like environmental health or regulating industry or like keeping them in check. But I think all of that work is really like undeveloped, because, it's not a priority by those who are deploying this stuff. So yeah, I think there's lots of really interesting possibilities there, especially also like in the citizen science space. And we think about, like how these technologies could be used for activism and for activist tactics, to bolster that sort of work.
All right.
I haven't done work with crypto, so I'm not really, I don't really feel like I can comment on that, but yeah.
All right. Does anyone have any last comments or questions for us? Yes, we have a hand over here.
I found it a very powerful quote to end on, the quote that ethics is not a calculation, and kind of made me think that it's ethics as something that can only unfold in the very moment of temporality. It seems almost antithetical to machine learning or automation. And I was just wondering, I think it's almost kind of a difficult question to ask, but couldn't such judgments be ever incorporated into machine learning or automation? Or is it going to be, as I think it is maybe for now, sort of that we automate something and then we can only make the judgment in a humanitarian way in the very moment and here and now, but it can never be really incorporated into these ways that a machine will make things unfold?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really exciting question. I also think so. I'm not. I think there are different ways to go at it. So, for example, this idea that an algorithm cannot comprehend a situation, that's a human understanding of that, right? So there's, I would say, a school of thought where people would say, yeah, but yes, there's a different comprehension. At some point, there will be a singular machine that is so intelligent that it will be a different kind of intelligence, right? So, and then that also means that there is a different kind of ethics. But I think that is a very misleading kind of techno-liberal dream or something. So I would say at the moment it's difficult, but there's maybe what could be interesting is that there's an analogy made between code and ethics and law, basically. I think one of the books would be Code as Law. So in a way, right, law or ethics for that matter also are something that we write down, and then the enacting, that's a completely different thing, which is why I think that quote by Karen Barat is so beautiful, where she says it's about responding and being responsible, right? And there's also this term of responsibility. So yeah, I think this is something that lives in the moment in a way, and there can be possibly a role for technology there, but I don't think it can be outsourced. Is that an answer? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thanks to all our panelists for their great contributions tonight. Let's give them another round of applause. I think we've covered a lot of ground tonight in terms of, well, especially in this last session about the ethical implications of what we're doing, and how even though we're headed for post-human territories, we still have a lot of work to do molding our technologies in the more ethical frame, as challenging as that might be, and also to continue to take responsibility and work together on the solutions that will help us exist on a more bearable planet, or as bearable as we can make it in the coming years. So thanks for all of your thoughts on these issues. It's been very thought-provoking. So we're going to close the night now tonight. I just have one little announcement, which is that the festival, of course, everyone at home is enjoying it free of charge, and we have our small gathering here, which is also very nice. But the festival also could really use your financial support. So if you can, and if you are willing, to go to fiberfestival.nl/pay. Very simple and easy to remember. You can also donate to support our programming, which is always really appreciated. Tomorrow we're back here at the Brakke Grond at 10 a.m. to continue with the rest of our sessions, the rest of our conference. And then also tomorrow night there will be the musical program following the conference. And there's on Sunday the possibility that's your last chance to also see the exhibition. So that's our program for the coming days. Thank you for joining us, and good night.